Welcome, everyone. Good morning or good evening, depending on where in the world that you are. Ravi, are we on a 12-hour difference?
We are a bit more than 12 hours right now. I assume where you are is that 10:30 a.m. Is that 8 a.m.?
It's 10:30, yes.
10:30. Yeah, with 12-hour difference. That's right.
Gotcha. So one of the things that I appreciate about the Qapita team is that you guys are distributed all around the world, and so you effectively keep founder hours. When folks are on nights and weekends or post parenting bedtime, the second shift hours, there's always somebody at Qapita working.
Part of the JD.
There you go. So we're gonna
Go ahead.
talk about advising and bringing advisors onto the cap table. And just to sort of establish a baseline, can we talk about the different flavors of advisors and like what we even mean? Because there's this sort of Venn diagram of like, there are some people on our cap table potentially that have not invested and are not fully employed, but they may not all be advisors. So like, who are we actually talking about?
Well, let's think of I'm thinking aloud now, Charlie, but there's the type of advisors we've seen on cap tables, and there's a wide range of archetypes, and there's the domain expert, the subject matter expert archetype. Like, so, I need help with a certain regulation, I need to understand. So there is a very specific pointed domain expertise that you're looking for. There's the sounding board coach archetype. I want to, yeah, there's that is largely boils down to the founder equation with a coach sounding board. There is the door opener network expander archetype, and there is the intermediary, I'll help you with a fundraise archetype. There's just someone you just get for personal brand credibility or halo effect. So those are the five kind of, I think, ranges that I have seen. I don't think I'm missing anything here. There's a fractional employee piece, someone you may want to potentially hire, but it's just not the right time for some reason, like can eventually become an employee. I've seen that's less common, but I've also seen that happen. Someone who comes on board as an advisor or in a fractional capacity for some time and then eventually converts into a full-time employee. That's the less common. The other five are more common.
And I would argue that you said that it may not be the right time. I feel like some of those people, it's not the right time because I just don't have any money yet. So it's not the right time for me to have any money to actually pay them. So I am offering them equity and maybe calling them an advisor, but I probably would have them full time.
I mean, there's two things. One is not right time for the company or the founder, in the sense that you can't afford, and that's relatively common at early stage. And there is this bit. There's a founder. There's the advisor dynamic. I would love to come on board full time, but I can't for whatever reason. I'm in another city. I'm not in the right place. I need a bridge. But let's build an equation of trust before we I jump into this full time. There's usually you're bridging to an eventual outcome that you have discussed, but for whatever reason, it's a time bridge. It's to get there.
Gotcha. And so when I think about equity compensation and having them be on my cap table, what does a good offer that works for both sides kind of look like? Like, what's a starting point? I mean, first of all, is it standardized? Are there certain aspects of an offer that is generally standard? Let's talk about size. Like, how do I even think about, is it dollar for equity? How much equity should I be giving out if I have an advisor relationship? How do I think through that?
Yeah, let's put that into two or three buckets. There's the early stage, and then there is Series A stage, and then there is everything above that. So I think early stage, from a quantum perspective, percentage terms, in terms of value of the company, we've seen that range anywhere between 0.25% to 1.25% of the company, and that's a broad enough range. a larger number of advisors at the lower end of that than the higher. There has to be a special reason for this to be on the higher end of that spectrum, above the single digit percentage point mark. And then, as you go between seed series A, there is some investors on the cap table. Equity starts becoming expensive or scarce or pricier. That tends to get to 0.2% to 0.75% thereabouts at those stages. And then it's much closer. It almost halves for the next stage of the company. Anything beyond the series A stage, which then is 0.1% to 0.5% at the top end. And those are the broad ranges. There's always exceptions to these things, but a normal distribution, that will be like a 5 sigma type of cutoff.
And how many, like, do all companies have advisors on their cap table? If so, how many are you seeing? And is there a certain, if I needed more, should I think of this as a small advisory pool? Is there a certain amount that is too many?
I think it's difficult to generalize, and you don't anticipate. I mean, one thing about the founder journey is you can't really anticipate what you need, and you haven't figured everything out. You're iterating rapidly, and therefore, I don't think there needs to be anything cast in stone with respect to when should I really start thinking about creating an advisor, or is this the right time? I guess it's need based, and it happens. You need an expertise, you need a bridge, and it's driven by that. So I think too many advisors doesn't really work. It's the same too many cooks kind of metaphor. So it doesn't really work. And usually a focused assignment or a very specific deliverable or objective tends to work much better, same as OKR or a job description or the role anyone's playing in your business. And we can talk a bit about that. In terms of numbers, do all companies have advisors? No, I don't think so. Have we seen many startups have advisors? I think the answer is yes. At some point, I think in the journey, the founder tends to look, or sometimes we've seen boards and investors recommend bringing on someone to an advisor because they see the founder grappling with a specific problem. And you may even see advisory panels at some of the VC firms, and you may be closer to this, but I've seen VC firms offer this as a value add, saying, there's a couple of GTM advisors we would know, or there's a couple of people who can help you deal with fintech regulation, and that this tends to be specific. And so we've also seen investors recommend certain advisors based on past experience that they've had with their portfolio and so on. And so, I think typically this is to the founder, and at later stages, maybe one level down. That's that.
Mhm.
This is you're talking about, and therefore too many is too much dilution of attention. And so I think there is an optimal number to this, but that's a function of attention of the founder or founders, case maybe, and that's that.
You brought up the different advisory groups that are sometimes attached to investment firms. And I don't know if you've seen, when I see those groups, are those people usually folks that my investors might be providing access to me for free? Or is this a group that there's a standard deal where they say, hey, we've curated a group here, and they might take a call with you, but actually we've done some of the handiwork to have a standard deal, and so I might get people from the firm that I still have to pay in equity.
Well, the larger investment firms have the wherewithal to provide expertise on tap for free. And, I think founders who've been lucky to raise capital or who've actually managed to attract those kind of firms can have a good access to good set of expertise on tap, and that's his expertise on tap offered to you by your investment firm, and that's available to you. I wasn't referring to that. It's the latter, which is where we've curated a small group of individuals. They may be available to you. Why don't you have a chat and see if there's good chemistry, and then there's a commercial equation that the founder has to figure out. Usually tends to be the case with smaller non-platform like venture firms, and not so much the big platforms, which have a large team and expertise.
Gotcha. In addition to size of grant, what are the other sort of basics where if I say, hey, there's going to be someone who's kind of helping at this early stages on the journey. I think they would be useful to bring them into the firm. What are the other features of an agreement that I need to think about from a structuring point of view? That's the commercial nature of this relationship. Is it time? Are there different clauses that I need to worry about?
The best agreements are those where everything is spelled out very clearly. The best advisor relationships are those where actually once it's articulated very clearly, it goes out of the window and you've built such a great equation with the advisor that you can call him or her at any time of need. And you're not really looking at, have you exactly given me the number of hours you wanted to give me this thing, because it didn't matter. The equation is so powerful, or so they're so invested emotionally, mentally into the business, that you can call them anytime. Notwithstanding that equation, it's always best to articulate, because just like anything else, contracts exist for a reason. You need to articulate so that the objective is stated. And I think we may have had this in the context of co-founders agreement as well. Like you write it down and then you don't look at it again unless necessary. It may not be a good thing when you're looking at it again in that context, and it's somewhat similar. So there is the commercial aspect of it, which is monetary, which is cash plus usually some kind of a retainer fee plus equity in the mix, or a combination of those two. And there is the hours that you would spend. There is the specific objective, and I think the most effective ones is where the specific objective is clearly articulated. And there's one other thing which I think, having an out, any contract should have a way contract ends if things are not going the right way, and that's mutually beneficial. I think everyone wants a good advisor will understand that, and therefore having some kind of a mutual termination clause in there. I think those would be the simple constructs, the specific objective being by far the most important piece of the
Now,
contract.
are those out clauses usually structured like, let's say, for example, you're going to be my go-to-market advisor. You have a broad network of startups that I could sell my business to. I would like you to make 100 introductions over the next year. If you don't make 100, and you're at 99, is the agreement automatically terminated? Like, how do I actually facilitate, like, I don't think you did what's in the agreement, and I don't really feel like giving you equity?
you know Typically you get someone as an advisor where you're also want to kind of maintain the relationship and so on afterwards. So it's not so much 99 or 100, it's the broad sense that it's working or not working. So there is an advantage to being specific about the objectives, and there is the termination is usually the most common termination clause we've seen is a 3-month mutual consent or 3-month notice termination to this. So there is enough, and the objectives are usually 2 or 3 specific things, like 100 introductions, or I want this regulatory white paper written, and I want to make sure I get this license.
I just want to put a pin on something you said. You said 3 months. That's really interesting to me that it would have such a short time frame. Does that mean that it is useful to outline something that both sides feel confident should happen in the first 3 months? That it's not, so for example, if I was wanting somebody to be an advisor who, helps me give visibility into like what happens on my board meetings, like I might not have another board meeting for another 3 months. That's a very surprising and like near term cutoff for an agreement.
Sorry, maybe I wasn't clear, Charlie. I think what I meant was typical advisor contracts or agreements are 2 years duration. So the term contract is 2 years. The mutual termination clause is a 3-month notice. So it's not an abrupt end. You have an off ramp, and you're able to manage the termination, or
Oh, I see. So this is like almost like putting an employee on a performance improvement plan in a
or
sense.
in some sense, or say, hey, I don't think it's working, let's see if we can make this work. Let's give it a good shot for 3 months. If it doesn't work, then we'll figure out another way to engage at a later point in time. And that's a so it gives you an opportunity
Is
to.
that the same as a cliff?
No, cliff is independent. Cliff is just the start. When
Okay.
does it kick off? It's irrespective of the cliff. You're past the cliff period. Let's say the cliff is a 3 month cliff, and then you decide for whatever reason after 1 year this is not relevant anymore, and so there's no need. There's no, and therefore at that point in time you're. So let's say it's a 2 year contract and you decide to terminate after year one, or you think it's not really working, or you need someone else to kind of take you to the next step forward. And so it's having that 3 month notice period or termination by mutual consent with a 3 month notice is to facilitate that difficult conversation should that scenario arise, that you give an off ramp and say, look, I don't think it's working out. Why don't we try this for 2 or 3 months, another 3 months, like we said, otherwise it'll cut off. And it's just an off ramp.
Gotcha. Okay, so if I walk through the timing, our whole contract and fulfilling the contract, the standard might be 2 years.
Mhm.
It might have a 1 year cliff, and the cliff is you have to work at least this long to earn anything. If we cut this off beforehand, I don't owe you anything. So, at a minimum, I want you working for a year. But then there's also 3 months notice that we sort of agree that if we end, regardless of when the cliff happens, regardless of when the contract ends, I'm not going to do it abruptly, because I think a key point that you said is that you're probably picking people that you still want to maintain a good relationship with. I mean, to be honest, you want to maintain a good relationship with everybody. There's no reason. I mean, the startup world is very small, right? And so the 3 months, I think, is a good addition to say, outside of everything else, we'll be transparent and upfront with each other. And if this isn't working out for any reason, we're going to give each other a heads up.
That's exactly right. I think it's a heads up. It's a heads up checkpoint kind of mechanism. On the cliff for advisor agreements, because they tend to be shorter duration, and we've seen the cliff can be as early as 3 months. Vesting is typically monthly, quarterly. Those are the most common vesting periods there are, or vesting schedules that you put into the contract. Yeah, and the rest of it it's just a heads up checkpoint. It's useful to have that put into the contract, so it's easy to bring that up. It's making an uncomfortable conversation have a structure to it.
I don't often hear advisors say that their startups are making the best use of them. But at the same time, I can't think of too many times where an advisor literally effectively gets fired or let go. I feel like founders often give advisor equity away, and just kind of a lot of times it's small and they sort of let it go. Is there a value to sort of good hygiene, or just, if something's not working out, actually cutting off, not having all these extra people on your cap table who didn't actually do anything for the company? What's a reason to actually stay on top of this and to make sure that if you're giving equity away, the person's actually earning or you're getting value? Or should I just not sweat it because it's 10 basis points?
Oh, I think equity is expensive. I mean, if you think about that kind of equity from an employee standpoint, that's valuable. If it's valuable to you, it's valuable to your potential employee, and it's typically comparable or higher to an employee equity depending on the stage or value. And therefore, I think the problem more often tends to be out of sight, out of mind. Yeah, you're not actually leveraging enough. So I think a regular cadence and putting a discipline to engagement, contract, objectives, timelines, milestones, typical project management stuff that kind of ensures the founding team is also extracting the value once it's there, because that's so many directions a founder gets pulled in, and easy to kind of lose track of it. Just boils down to have you put in the effort, and if you're putting in the effort and it's not working, that's when the mutual termination by mutual consent thing comes up, because now you're on top of this. Usually the advice not getting fired piece that you talked about is because you haven't put in enough into the relationship or into the engagement, or put some discipline to it, and therefore you feel there's inadequate. You haven't. inadequate data to have that discussion on this is not working out. But I think equity is expensive. We manage cap tables for in our business. Equity is for with a founder's hat on, equity is an expensive, scarce resource. So you need to, I think, something you can. That's a lot of equity from a potential full-time hire perspective. So I wouldn't.
I think it's interesting that founders who go out and fundraise and try and convince VCs that this equity is going to be incredibly valuable don't always think of it that way when handing it out. To a VC, they say the equity is really valuable. But the way they operate their business, they act like cash is the only valuable thing. And the
Yeah.
equity is just all sort of, fictitious until it becomes real.
Yeah, useful to have that reminder in some form. And how would I think about this quantum of equity if I was talking to a VC? That's a good cheat code to ensure you're being judicious about the equity you give and the choice of advisors you make. In fact,
So
I've the note you put out ahead of this discussion, and I was going through it, and I was a banker by profession before doing this. In fact, from a early stage founder's perspective, in all the archetypes that we discussed early on, the worst there is someone who says, I'll help you get a fundraise done. I think that is.
and why is that?
I was an M&A banker, fundraising expert, working alongside founders in my past life, and that's always useful once you're a large company, a Series B plus. That's when your time is better spent in the business, and fundraise is an additional activity. For the early stage founder, there's almost like this adverse selection type of view that I've seen VCs take when say you're a founder, you have to be able to tell your story well enough to fundraise because you're going to do this several times over. So why do you need an advisor to come back to help you fundraise? Because that's an essential quality of a scalable founder. So there's that view. And second is like, the advisor will never have the same equity or passion that the founder will have. And so the founder has to tell the story. So the only places where I've seen early stage advisory work when the advisor is also conscious enough to be furniture in the room when he or she needs to be in a fundraise advisory type of solution. You're not making the pitch, it's the founder's pitch. You're at best opening a door, or you're being a sounding board for the founder to prepare. At later stages, it tends to be different. The process, there's the data room, and there's a scale to the business. The numbers matter more than the narrative, and so on.
So it's a question of how common that is it that advisors actually transition into employees? And also, I think, does it go the other way as well? Sometimes I've seen early co-founders who don't make it the rest of the way through the company transition into more advisory capacities with the company. So is it easy to transition back and forth?
Yeah, it's a different role. So you're transitioning to a different role. So there's no reason for that to be very different. I've rarely seen co-founders getting advisor equity after moving out. By definition, they have some equity to start with. But employees, we've seen transition into, like, it's a senior employee for whatever reason they can't continue full time, or it's undesirable from the business perspective for them to have that full time role, or it just turns out that the employee you have is a better coach than a captain, and therefore that's the best role for them. So I've seen senior employees transition from a reverse flow perspective. I've seen many advisors take on full-time roles because the business has grown big, the problem's so big, you're so close to the business, the trust equation is established, and now let's take it to the next orbit.
Cool. Before we wrap up, and this has all been super helpful and insightful, Alan asked a good question about advisors having relationships to investors, and I think you'll probably agree with me, coming from the banking side. I can't think of a single investor who is swayed to invest in a company purely because of a relationship. And I think at the end of the day, the founder ultimately is the one convincing the investor to invest. And I think the nature of access is just, VCs are fairly accessible these days. They're all at newsletters, they're on LinkedIn, they're showing up to events like, pretty soon it's going to be Tech Week in New York and you're going to be able to throw a rock and hit a VC that's just, out in the streets. Would you agree that anybody who comes to you and says, I have a network of relationships, ultimately you can probably replicate that on your own as a founder?
You would consider that, and 100% agree with what you have said. I've not seen. I think you think of that as reducing the time for your fundraise potentially, because you've been introduced with warm intros. The best economic way to describe that, it's a signal of value and not the value itself, and therefore you finally have to be in the room and deliver. You're compressing the time it takes for you to be in every theater or stage that's possible, but you have to perform in the theater yourself. There's no yeah, yeah.
It's a time savings. It's not a promise of success.
Exactly. There's
Right.
absolutely no, it's not a certainty thing, it's just a time compression.
Okay. Before we go, tell us where your knowledge of all of these cap tables comes from in the sense of what Qapita do you for founders. What's the 30-second pitch on your software?
Yeah, I mean, we help companies organize their ownership incredibly well. Where we differentiate from anyone else is providing the highest quality of service at an affordable solution, which means we do the full turnkey thing on the cap table stuff, anything that the founder may need around cap tables and ownership. And we tend to work much better when there is a international element to it or a complexity element to this. Yeah, I think we got into this business thinking founders companies need credible alternatives and choices. We started in one market, we were incredibly successful, and then we've expanded globally, and now the ambition is global, which brings back full circle to where we started this. You'll find one of us in every time zone, every part of the world that possibly can be from a founder's perspective. So that's
Cool. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. Really appreciate it. And we will talk to you again soon.
thank you so much, Charlie. Have a good
All
day.
right.